Next up, it's my pleasure to announce we have Kate Lister from the Open University is going to be speaking, and she's going to be talking on embedding mental well-being in technology, enhanced learning. So over to you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you very much, everybody, for having me here today. It is such a pleasure to be here and talking to you guys about my favourite project in the world, which is the project that's been taking over my life for the last 3 years in the best way, which is about embedding mental well-being in I called it this one for technology enhanced learning, but it's actually in distance learning curricula. So can I just check, can I get a nod from everybody first of all to make sure you can see my slides and you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Brilliant, so we're off to a good start. So normally I'd start a presentation like this by giving you guys a bit of an overview about why mental well-being isn't distance learning is important, or some of the things that we need to do in this area. But honestly, after Maren's presentation just now, it seems like everybody's really quite well aware of that. Mental well-being as a student mental well-being in particular has absolutely shot to the surface over the last couple of years. But I work for the Open University, which is a big distance learning provider in the UK. And we've been aware of this for an awfully long time because we've been doing distance learning for a very, very long time, long before it was cool. So in that case, I'm just going to go straight on into my presentation and tell you guys about the project that we've been doing. So the project is looking at ways to embed mental well-being in distance learning. We had 3 core research questions, which were: what are the barriers and enablers to mental well-being that students experience in distance learning? What are the solutions that students and staff perceive would reduce these barriers, and how can these solutions be embedded in distance learning? So the most important thing to say, first of all, is that we're taking a very, very social model approach here. We're not looking at the students and thinking what's wrong with the students, what are the deficits within the students. We're looking at the environments. We're trying to identify what the barriers are and what the enablers are within the environment that we can change to support better student mental well-being in distance learning. So the project started way back in 2018 and it's had 4 stages. Stage 1 was interviews. We had 16 students tell their stories and 5 tutors tell the stories of the students that they'd supported. The thematic analysis of the results of those interviews revealed that a wide range of barriers and enablers, which we've got represented as a taxonomy, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. But first of all, I'm going to talk you through the rest of the project quickly. After that, we turned the student stories into some rather beautiful vignettes, which could be shared with staff more broadly as a way of highlighting the barriers and the enablers that students experience while maintaining their confidentiality. And I've also got an example of one of those that I'm going to show you too. After that, we held some fairly large-scale focus groups. We had 116 staff and students who analysed the vignettes. They looked over all of the different vignettes. They identified what they thought the barriers and the enablers were, and they collaborated on ideas for solutions. Then out of those solutions, stage 3, 7 of those solutions got piloted as practice projects. And then finally, we had a survey with students where we substantiated the barriers, the enablers, and the ideas for solutions with a much wider group of students. And I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of some of those results now. So as I promised, the first thing I wanted to mention was the taxonomy of barriers and enablers that students experience. The big headline finding that came out of this was that anything can be a barrier and anything can be an enabler, depending on how it is designed and how the student experiences it. So that's why I've got the taxonomy represented as a wheel, and you can map the barriers directly across the corresponding enablers. Almost anything could be a barrier or an enabler. So the barriers and the enablers were divided into 3 core sections. There was environmental barriers, including spaces, physical spaces, online spaces, people, including peers and family and all sorts of people, university systems, and just generally life. Then there were skills-related barriers or enablers, which included social skills, self-management skills, including kind of confidence, identity, self-efficacy, and all of these kind of things, and study skills, which were really important as well. And then finally, there were study-related barriers and enablers, which included assessment, tuition, and curriculum, as you can imagine. I'm aware that this taxonomy is going to be quite hard for you to see, so I'm just going to pop a quick link in the chat right now, which will take you to the project webpage where you can download it, and there's all the other project resources are on there as well. And I've got a link to that on the bottom of the slide here as well. So Right. The other thing that came out of this stage one, after we did the analysis and found the barriers and enablers in the taxonomy, like I said, we turned these into vignettes to show the student experiences in a way that we could share them with staff while maintaining student confidentiality. And that was what I wanted to show you next, was one of these examples. So this is an example of a student vignette. This is Vanessa. Vanessa is not a real person, and this is an AI generated graphic. But a lot of the words on this vignette have come directly from student experiences, and I jigsawed them. I kind of took bits from one student and bits from another and edited them for clarity while trying to maintain the authenticity of the student voice as far as possible. There are 10 of these in total, and you can download them on the same website link that I shared. So we used these vignettes with 116 staff and students, as I mentioned, in a whole load of focus groups. And we identified what staff perceived the barriers for students to be and the enablers for students to be. And I've got a little graph here for you to show you. So happily, the staff actually identified all of the same themes as I'd identified in my taxonomy. So hooray, that model worked. And this is the number of references across the focus groups to the different barriers and enablers. So we've got the enablers at the top here, what staff and students perceive to be the enablers, and then the barriers at the bottom. As you can see, there was one absolutely huge barrier that came up again and again and again, and that was the self-management one. And it was about confidence, about identity, about managing yourself, about self-efficacy, and all of these kind of areas. So staff perceived this to be the biggest barrier for students. And then there were lots of other sort of smaller ones around curriculum and tuition and systems and spaces. And there was some about life, and a little bit about social skills, but there were quite a lot of others that they didn't really think were so important, like assessment and people and study skills, interestingly enough. And they thought that one of the key enablers was the curriculum, and then to a lesser extent, the tuition, and then the systems as well over here was quite a large enabler as well. So this was the staff perspective, and then the staff went away and created some projects, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I also went out to students in a survey to find out what students perceived the barriers and enablers to be, like how many students out of my survey would perceive the different barriers and different enablers in different places. And I've created the same graph for the student perspective. And I'll show you it now, and you can see whether you think it's going to be very, very different or very, very similar to the staff one. I'll give you a moment to think about that before I change. And here we go. As you can see, it's really quite different. So the places where students perceived the barriers and the enablers was really quite different from where the staff perceived the barriers and the enablers. So first of all, as you can see at the top, students saw a lot of enablers in their distance learning, which was wonderful for me as a distance learning practitioner. They found it a really positive experience. They spoke very warmly about the curriculum, the tuition, the study skills, about their confidence, their identity and self-management skills. People, spaces, all of these came up as clear enablers for the students. Barriers, on the other hand, most of them were fairly minimal, apart from two massive barriers around the areas of assessment and life circumstances. So that's really quite different if I just flick back briefly to the staff perception of where the barriers and the enablers lay, where assessment was this tiny little one here, and life was fairly small as well, or life circumstances was fairly small as well. So I think that's a really interesting lesson that I've learned from this, that it's really important to get a very wide stakeholder view to make sure that you're really understanding where these perceptions of barriers and enablers lie. Because I'm not saying that one group is particularly right or one group is particularly wrong, just that there's different perspectives. So I'm aware I've only got
a minute and a half left, Kate.
I was just about to say, I'm aware I've only got about 2 minutes left, so I'll whiz on fairly quickly through my last couple of slides. Thank you. So as I said, the staff came up with 7 ideas for projects that they believed would address the barriers. We came up with one for staff training, which was a micro-credential on embedding mental wellbeing in the curriculum, which is now launched and is about in its 4th presentation. Learning design, we came up with a model for learning design that would embed mental wellbeing throughout the learning design considerations, and that's been rolled out now. We had student resources, so we've got the My Wellbeing pages, which are discipline-specific guidance and resources for students, which sit on their subject site, and it's very, very specific to the discipline and the programme in which they're working, which we hope will be useful. We've got something around tutorials, which is a self-assessment tool for tutors, helping them to audit wellbeing in their tutorial materials. One around curriculum content. We've got so guidance and support for students, particularly for studying distressing topics, because that came up as a theme. University systems, we've got a badged open course for disabled students allowance needs assessors so they can better support students. And then finally, one around transitions, which was a wellbeing strategy for the careers team. These projects are all live now, and they're going to be evaluated over the next few years, few months, who knows, it'll depend on the one. However, we did ask students in the survey how they felt about this, and they were extremely positive about them. So the blue lines that you can see here are the people who thought yes, said yes, I think this project will help my wellbeing. And the biggest ones were the teacher training, the Embedding Mental Wellbeing micro-credential, and the discipline-specific guidance that would be on subject sites. But all of them had a very, very positive response. They also had their own suggestions for things that they'd like to change. The biggest one, interestingly for me, was around communication. So students wanted regular check-ins, they wanted proactive contacts from their tutors, from the university, from student support teams and people like that. They wanted to feel like the university knew who they were and cared about them. And that was a theme that really came out quite strongly. They came up with an awful lot of other suggestions, which I won't go through now just for time. But if you'd like to find out more about this, do get in touch. I've got a list here of further resources, including the project website again, and a few other bits and pieces. Feel free to use the Our Journey tool if you'd like to create your own vignettes, and get in touch. I would love to talk to people about this more, and I'd love to be able to replicate this in other institutions if anybody's interested. So thank you very much. I should be just on time, Phil.
You are, yes, and I think you're about to be mobbed as well. So that was a fantastic talk. Thank you. There were a lot of, I think, really important messages there that a lot of institutions could certainly learn from. So thank you for taking the time. We had one question in the chat that I thought would just be a quick one. How would you define well-being?
That's a really good question, and that was something that actually took a good hour in each of the focus groups that I went to. There's lots of different ways to define well-being, and I've written a whole literature review around it as well. Ultimately, I don't believe that there is one particular definition of well-being that can work internationally and across different institutions. And so one thing that I always say when I'm talking to institutions is if you're doing anything in wellbeing, it's really important to first of all define what you mean by it in your context so that you can have a clear scope of where you're going to be doing the work. One resource that I point people to, which I can't now remember the name, it's got a beautiful name. One of those things. I can give you a link to it. It's been quite a popular paper, but it's about the difference between mental health and mental well-being and how those two come together. But I can pop the link in the chat.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, and apologies, it's not an easy one to answer at all. When I said that, it's yeah, I think it's an important one to address. But thank you. I think we have time for one quick question, and Natalia has her hand up. Natalia, I've unmuted your mic, so you should be able to. Well, I've given you the ability to unmute your own mic. So if you wanted to ask a question, please do so now. No. Does anyone else? Would anyone else like to ask a quick question? Okay then. Well, in the interest of time, I think we'll move on. But thank you, Kate. There are a lot of comments in the chat, so if you did have time to have a look through, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
I certainly will. Thank you very much.